people saying that World wasn't ported to Switch because of hardware limitations, that's called revisionist history. That idea requires you to believe that things happened in a different order and at different times than they obviously, clearly, actually did. Let me just put it very clearly for you. It is a myth that World could never run on the Switch because of hardware limitations. This idea that the game is too amazingly, breathtakingly good and advanced that the Switch would never be able to run it. Now, I can sum up my counter-argument with one quick sentence, but obviously I'm not going to leave it at that. But for those of you who want to get right to the point and don't really care to take the time to look at the actual facts of history, this should suffice for you. Here it goes. If Doom Eternal runs on Switch and runs well, then Monster Hunter World absolutely could too. Even if you provisionally agree with that statement, still remains the fact that World was never ported to the Switch. And so you might be left thinking, well, why wasn't it ported to the Switch then, if not hardware limitations? I can't think of any other reason why it was never ported to the Switch. Therefore, it must be the only reason that I can think of, which is that the Switch sucks. Well, look, I won't even argue with you that the Switch sucks. All right? The processor and the GPU were designed about a decade ago. The Switch is not the most powerful thing on the market, and that's okay. But it is powerful enough to run a whole host of amazing looking games. You don't have to go very far to find this out. You might be familiar with a channel called Digital Foundry. Well, you can look them up and you can see some amazing games that they've tested running on the Switch that look really good. They have big open maps with lots and lots of clutter and lots of things going on and lots of enemy AI and far more game mechanics than World has and at far faster pace than World has. And they're running very well. So while Switch hardware may suck, it doesn't suck bad enough that World won't run on it. Now, there is another major reason why World was never ported to the Switch, and it's definitely not this one. A lot of what I'm about to explain to you about why World wasn't ported to the Switch can be boiled down to this idea. People don't understand what it takes to make a new Monster Hunter game. And the fact that Capcom has put out a new Monster Hunter game every 2.5 years with so many different platform changes throughout the life of the series is actually an incredible feat. We just take for granted that the next Monster Hunter is going to come out on time on whatever platform makes the most sense, and Capcom is going to nail it every single time. It's going to be largely bug-free. It's going to be far more balanced than any other game out there, and we're going to love it. We take that for granted. Of course, a lot of you don't love Rise, but that's beside the point. 7 million other people do, and it is a solid game all around. And yeah, we do take it for granted. Most of you guys don't understand what Capcom has to do to make that happen. So let's talk a little bit about that too. All right, so let's take a look at the real reason why Monster Hunter World Iceborne was not ported to the Switch. Now, historically, Capcom targets the next Monster Hunter release for the platform that will have the largest install base at the time of the release of that game. This idea just makes good business sense. It's what any company would want to do. And so they release a new Monster Hunter game every 2 to 2.5 years. And so that gives them enough time to see where the market's going and to make a reliable prediction as to which platform is going to be the best one to put their game on. As the games get bigger and bigger, their development cycle takes longer and longer. It's gotten to the point where their development cycle is about 5 years. In order to continue to release games every 2.5 years, they have to develop 2 different games side by side. They're always working on 2 Monster Hunter games, and they've staggered the development cycle by 2.5 years in order to continue to give us Monster Hunter games in a timely manner and in order to continue to predict where the market's going in terms of the platform. Now, since Monster Hunter really came of age at a time when platform hardware was changing very radically, Capcom had this additional hurdle of having to update their game engine for each new platform that they switched to. So if you take a look back in time, we've had Monster Hunter on PlayStation 2. We've had the simultaneous development of Monster Hunter on PlayStation Portable. Then we moved over to the Wii, which is very different hardware from PlayStation 2. Then we moved over to the 3DS. Then we moved to the Wii U. Not too much different from the Wii. Then we ported to the PlayStation 3 at one point, and then jumped over to the PlayStation 4, Xbox One platform, then jumped to the Switch and also the PC. Yeah, this is no small task. Back when the game had a much smaller scope, it was easier to do than it is now, but it still wasn't easy. It still took a lot of time and a lot of effort to update the game engine. We're not talking about the game itself. We're not talking about adding new features. We're talking about getting the skeleton, the structure of the game to run on new hardware. This means rewriting code that already exists in order to work with the new system and then optimizing it for that new system. Much harder to do in the early 2000s and early teens because the software development tools that we have available to us today are so much better than back then. So much easier to write code now. So much easier to import your assets and build the structure of the game now than it was back then. And some of these platforms were extremely underpowered compared to today's platforms. So optimization was critical. Now, when it came time for Capcom to work on World, they had to address a lot of different challenges happening all at the same time. First of all, they had to target entirely new hardware they'd never had to work with in the past. On top of that, they decided to develop entirely new game systems. World was going to be very different from anything that had come before it, and they had grand visions, pie in the sky visions for this title. On top of that, they had to do something else they'd never done before. They had to implement a lot of westernized game design features. They had to step up their graphical fidelity. That includes things like modeling, character modeling, monster modeling. They had to do motion capture. They had to work with textures that had a much higher resolution than anything they worked with before. Not only creating those textures, but getting them to work properly in their game engine and optimize for the particular platform. They wanted to add in atmospheric effects that previous Monster Hunter titles didn't really have much of, like crazy lighting effects, atmospheric effects, water effects, and then all the endemic life, all the little things moving around, the foliage moving around. Number you hear thrown about a lot is that there were 300 developers who worked on the project. That's probably an underestimate. In fact, if you go back and look at the Capcom quote, it's translated as saying, "We have 300 people working on it right now." That's after they say the number of people changes throughout the development process, but we have 300 people working on it right now. That means there's only 300 people working on it right now, but dozens, hundreds of others have already worked on it and are no longer working on it. And then hundreds of others will be working on it after these 300 do their part and hand it off. So 300 is probably an underestimate. It's probably closer to 1,000 people whose hands touched that project. Now, regardless of what the total number is, a lot of those people aren't working on Monster Hunter per se. They're working on the game engine itself. Okay, so they're not creating Monster Hunter. They're adding features to the game engine that will allow the game designers to implement their ideas within the game engine. So what this involves is not only expanding on the existing engine, but making it work on new hardware and then optimizing it for that hardware. This part alone is a huge investment of time and labor that every company tries to minimize as much as possible. So if you understand all that, then you'll be able to look back in time and see how that applies to what decisions Capcom made and when. So let's look at that timeline of what actually happened, when it happened, and we can see what decisions Capcom actually made and why they made them. So we're going to look at the timeline for World and put it in context. What was happening around the time that World was being developed and released. If you go back to November of 2013, the PlayStation 4 launches. Xbox One launches right around the same time. The Wii U has already been out for about a year by this point. So that launched at the end of 2012. And that's the alternative platform to the PlayStation 4, Xbox One. For those of you who don't know, PlayStation 4, Xbox One are essentially the same platform. They're identical hardware. There are a few differences in developing for these two platforms, but they are, in terms of optimization and porting, they're essentially the same platform. In 2015, so about a year later, because again, PlayStation 4 launched at the end of 2013, so early 2015, a little over a year later, a prototype of the next Monster Hunter title is being tested on that platform. This is Monster Hunter World. It's a prototype for World. So Capcom made a choice to develop a prototype for one of the 3 platforms that were in existence. You could probably say 4. You had the PlayStation handheld, you had the 3DS at that point, you had the Wii U, and you had the PlayStation Xbox/PC platform because, yeah, they're basically stripped down PCs. And so they chose to develop a prototype on the PlayStation 4 platform. All right, now, March of 2017, 2 years after they started developing their prototype, the Nintendo Switch releases. And then less than a year after that, Capcom finally releases World for PlayStation 4 and Xbox, and a little later after that for PC. What we can see is that sometime after the launch of PlayStation 4, Capcom decided to target that platform for their next title. All right. PlayStation 4 launches in 2013, and a year later, you have a prototype running on PlayStation 4. Why did they choose PlayStation 4 and not the Switch? Okay, that's the question. It's fair to say that at this point, when they were running their prototype, they didn't know anything about what Nintendo was going to do for its next console. They didn't know how powerful it was going to be. They didn't know the CPU-GPU combo that it was going to run. They didn't know that Nintendo was even going to have a home console to port to. They didn't know if everything was going to just be handheld from that point. There was a lot of speculation back then that Nintendo would just stop making hardware after the massive failure of the Wii U. What they did do, though, is they chose PlayStation 4 over Wii U, and that's fine. That makes sense. Okay, they knew, and they've told us this, that they were going to make a huge financial investment for the development of World in order to bring the game engine up to par and to port it to a new platform. They get one shot at this, folks. They get one shot. Are they going to go with an existing known platform with a rapidly growing install base in the PlayStation 4, Xbox, PC, or are they going to wait until they find out more about what Nintendo's doing? Are they going to pin all their hopes for the future on taking a chance or just waiting around for Nintendo to make a decision and tell them about it? Now, it wasn't even a choice. Businesses don't work that way. They have to go with what's available right now. So no, they didn't target the Switch. They didn't know the Switch even existed. When they made the decision to target a platform for World, those were their options, PlayStation 4 and Wii U. All right, what about the articles that say Capcom chose to go with home consoles because handhelds weren't powerful enough to do what they wanted to do with World? Remember, this is from 2015, when the Switch is still just a concept and very closely guarded. When Capcom said handhelds, they could not possibly be referring to the Switch. They're referring to the 3DS. The 3DS, people, not the Switch. When Capcom said we're not going to put it on a handheld because they're not powerful enough to run World. They're not powerful enough to do what we want to do with Monster Hunter. They said that when they didn't know what the Switch was. They said that when no one knew what the Switch was except a few key people within Nintendo. They're talking about the 3DS. The 3DS, which has, how many gigabytes of RAM does the 3DS? Just take a wild guess. You're wrong. It doesn't have a single gigabyte of RAM. It has 1/8 of a gigabyte of RAM. It has a 32-bit processor from the year 2005. It has a GPU from the year 2006. It has a screen resolution of 400 by 240. That's 1/4 of the resolution of 480p, which itself is about 1/4 the resolution of 1080p. They were not talking about the Switch. They didn't even know what the Switch was. And even if they did, they wouldn't invest tens of millions of dollars on an unknown Nintendo platform after the disastrous launch of the Wii U. Not to mention the inevitable delay that would ensue as a result of making that choice. The only option that Capcom had for the development of World was to target the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and PC. That's it. There wasn't really a choice to be made. Okay, fine. So we got that cleared up. World targeted PlayStation 4 because it was really the only option. Eventually, the Switch does release, right? Almost a year before World releases. And of course, Capcom knew about the Switch ahead of time. They probably knew about the Switch hardware maybe a year in advance of the launch. That's what Nintendo does. They inform major developers who develop for their platform. They give them the specs. They give them some prototype hardware. They give them a development kit, and they all sign non-disclosure agreements, and Capcom is going to honor that. Obviously, they're one of the biggest publishers in the world, and so they know about a year ahead of time what the Switch can do. And the Switch does release about a year before World releases, so they knew about 2 years in advance of the launch of World what the Switch hardware looked like. Okay, that's fine. The development cycle for World was over 5 years. So they'd already put 3 years of development into PlayStation 4. For them to jump ship from PlayStation 4 to Switch, or even develop it side by side with the PlayStation 4 version, you'd still see a significant delay, at least a 2-year delay, before you even saw something come out on Switch. And another huge investment. Okay, it's not just a time thing. It's not just a timing issue. It's another tens of millions of dollars to get this thing to work on Switch. We're going to go into that a little more in a minute. So the Switch does launch almost a year before World, becomes a huge success, selling over 10 million units in the first year. Why didn't Capcom decide to port World to the Switch? Why didn't they decide to take advantage of this huge new market in the Switch, even if there was going to be a time delay? Now we're finally getting to the meat of this, right? Okay, they couldn't have chosen to port to the Switch if they didn't know the Switch existed early on in the development cycle, fine. But when they did finally learn about the Switch, why didn't they choose to port to the Switch at that point? That's the only argument you can fall back to, isn't it? Well, I have 3 answers for you. 3 different answers to that question. The first answer is the PlayStation 4 Xbox platform was already 100 million strong and growing. So by the time the Switch was a year old, that platform by comparison was tiny. It was 1/10 of what Capcom's chosen platform was. Capcom made a great decision. It paid off. Betting on PlayStation 4 Xbox, by the time the game launched, there was 100 million potential customers. That's brilliant. That's the right decision. Switch, 10 million potential customers. Which customer base do you want for your product? All right, so the Switch platform was still very tiny by the time World launched. Why make a big investment only to expand your potential market by 10%? Why port it to another system and spend tens of millions of dollars doing so only for 10% potential increase? That's not how businesses work, folks. Not video game businesses, at any rate. That would be a stupid idea. The second reason why they didn't port World to the Switch was that World was selling faster than Capcom ever imagined that it would. It was already far exceeding expectations. Further development investment in the title was unnecessary. If your product is far exceeding your sales estimates, it makes no sense to start spending more money on development costs. You already spent so much money, more money than probably all previous versions combined. Why do you want to spend more when your product is doing phenomenally well beyond anything you ever dreamed? Why dump more money into it? The product is launched, it's doing great, you let it fulfill its sales potential. Okay, that's the second reason why they weren't looking at the Switch. No one's considering it. No one cares because this thing is popping off in a way that they never imagined. But what about that 10 million? What about the incredible sales numbers that the Switch would start posting year after year, becoming one of the most popular consoles of all time? Well, first of all, Capcom didn't know that was going to happen. They could have guessed that. They could have seen that 10 million in the first year, but it could have also gone the other way. Things could have just dropped off a cliff for the Switch. When you see the sales of the 3DS and how amazing that was, and then you see the sales of the Wii U and how absolutely horrible that was, how the hell do you know what's going to happen with a Nintendo product? At that point, people were saying Nintendo was going to go out of business. People were saying they were going to sell out to Microsoft. People were saying that they're going to stop making hardware. You just didn't know. All right, so there is a third answer to this question. If that's not enough for you, if those two answers are not enough for you, I have a third answer. Now, before I get to that, one more thing I want to mention. They didn't ignore the Switch platform for Monster Hunter, okay? They did port a Monster Hunter to the Switch to take advantage of that opportunity. Capcom's not stupid. They're actually really smart. They chose to port Generations Ultimate. They released Generations Ultimate in the West exclusively on Switch. Japan got it on the 3DS. This is a far smaller investment for them to make in order to gain entry to the Switch market with their Monster Hunter title. And that's a safe choice. And that's what they did. So they gave us GU on the Switch. Great game, by the way. All right, so for those of you who still aren't convinced, the third answer to why they didn't port to the Switch is not that the Switch was too underpowered to handle a portive world. If you really actually think about it, that notion is quite laughable. There are so many games running well on the Switch that are far more graphically and algorithmically demanding than World is. The real reason that they didn't port it to the Switch is this. Porting World to the Switch is a stupid idea. Capcom is smarter than you and me combined. Capcom is playing 3D chess here, while we're all over here playing checkers with Oreo cookies and eating half the pieces. The decision Capcom did make regarding Switch and Monster Hunter would set them up for massive Monster Hunter success for the next decade and a half. And I'm not talking about porting GU to the Switch. All right, they made another decision concerning Switch and Monster Hunter. Capcom was not going to make a big investment porting World to Switch. Why? Because that would only pay off for a single title. They were thinking bigger than that, much bigger. They were going to make a big investment that would pay off for multiple titles over more than a decade to come. Why? How can I justify that statement? Why would porting World to the Switch only pay off for one title? Here's why. MT Framework. The game engine that Capcom had been using for Monster Hunter titles on so many different platforms was getting very out of date. This is the engine that goes back, by this point, well over a decade. The tools they were using were very hard to prototype with. What that means is to put together a quick model of what you want to do with the game so people can test it out and see if it works the way they want it to work. See if it's actually fun, to see if it's interesting. And so this made it difficult to change designs and test out new game systems. And that slows down the creative teams when they can't see their vision and test it out and get feedback and then build upon that. So that extends the time to market for each new title that's created. If your engine sucks and slows you down, it's going to screw up your business. So they said, MT Framework, bye-bye. Capcom had another game engine that they developed internally. This one's called REVISIONIST. This one's more modern. It has all the scripting tools necessary for rapid development. The only thing that REVISIONIST didn't have was the features that the Monster Hunter team needed in order to make Monster Hunter titles using this newer, more modern game engine. So Capcom decided to sunset the MT Framework for all future Monster Hunter titles. That's right. The engine they used to develop every Monster Hunter title up to this point, they said, no more, we're not using it. Yes, the one they used for World, the one they spent tens of millions of dollars updating to get World to run. They said, that's the last time. We're not doing that anymore. We're not making that investment in a product that we're not going to use anymore, in a product that's going to slow us down. In its place, the real choice they made was to build out the RE engine to support Monster Hunter. But wait, there's more. What does that have to do with the Switch? They decided to simultaneously optimize all these new features that they're adding to the RE engine, not only for the PC platforms, the PlayStation, Xbox, and PC, but the Switch platform as well. And Monster Hunter Rise, the next game they're working on, would be the first test of this grand new vision. If they could pull off a multi-platform release of a Monster Hunter title on their newer, more modern, fully MHified game engine, then they could feel assured that the next several Monster Hunter titles could and would launch across all the platforms while also significantly reducing their development costs at the same time. No longer would they have to make a strategic decision about which platform to release on. No longer would they have to make huge investments porting their engine to yet another set of hardware. No longer would the 2-track Monster Hunter release schedule have to be limited to either one platform or the other. Now, Capcom could eat their cake and still have it. So, no. Capcom chose not to port World to the Switch, but not because of some vague idea of, quote, hardware limitations, unquote. They were busy building out the future of the franchise instead and thoroughly demonstrating it using the Switch hardware to do so. That very platform that so many people say is underpowered and would never run Monster Hunter World. Capcom chose that platform to test the future of Monster Hunter, to make sure their new Monster Hunter engine runs well and can do Monster Hunter. They didn't choose to port World to the Switch. No, that is small potatoes. They chose to port the entire future of the Monster Hunter series to the Switch. So if you think Capcom thought the Switch couldn't run Monster Hunter World, you're sadly mistaken, because Capcom believes that all future titles of Monster Hunter can run on the Switch. All of the Monster Hunters that are better than World, that are far more demanding than World, can run on the Switch. Monster Hunter Rise represents the culmination of this strategic decision that is far more important, far more profitable, and far more successful than a mere port of World to Switch would have been. It represents the future success of the franchise for a very long time to come, for both Kaname's Monster Hunter and Ichinose's Monster Hunter. That's right, Kaname's successor to World, the one which you guys love to call Monster Hunter 6 or World 2, is currently being developed on RE:Engine. Whatever you think Monster Hunter 6 is going to have in terms of design and gameplay, all those features are going to be made possible as a result of the work done on Monster Hunter Rise, not the work done on Monster Hunter World. The idea that Rise was a step backward couldn't be any further from the truth. It was a step into the future of the franchise, the most important decision Capcom has made thus far in the history of the Monster Hunter franchise. So, if you want to continue to believe that the Switch couldn't run World, go right ahead. You can believe that. You're wrong, but you can believe whatever you want. You can choose to be wrong in the face of the evidence to the contrary. So that's all I have for now. Let me know in the comments how wrong I am. You can nitpick this one. That should be the final word on it. I know it won't be. And if this has enlightened you in any way, let me know that too. You got any other information related to this topic, put it down there as well. And come on over to the Discord if you like to have rational, intelligent conversation about actual facts and reality. We'd love to have you.